Welcome to the Gregarious Babble podcast. This is Chris.
And this is Cate.
We are slightly different today. Cate is in sunny Berlin. And don't lie to me, I'm sure it's sunny. And I am in cold. I'm in cold and rainy Australia. And it is very early for me and very late for Cate. And the perils of time zones, and we're both kind of tired for different reasons. I'm drinking coffee, but I'm probably sure you're not.
No, I'm not drinking anything.
Okay. I have been back in Melbourne for a little bit. Spoke at a conference last week. I intended to check out a couple of meetups. I haven't done as many as I was intending to, because then damn friends invited me to their houses to have fun. But I did go on a startup tour of a town called Geelong, which I will get some reports back from soon. That was super interesting. And I'm actually going to a conference today and tomorrow. So I'll probably have more to report back on in the future. And then I'm going to stop in.
And you went to another conference, didn't you?
No, just...
Write the Docs one.
That's what I meant. I spoke at last Friday. Yeah. Yeah. But let's get on with the podcast, and maybe we'll cover differences between Germany and Australia in the next episode when I have a bit more to cover. Because we've got a little bit to cover, and we're both tired, so we'll get to the point, dear listeners. Okay, Cate. So, first article for you is about Bitcoin, and then I have my own anecdotes for Bitcoin.
Yes, the good old Bitcoin. And you may have seen today we've seen a very recent record high where the Bitcoin surpassed $10,000 in the value. I guess that's US dollars.
It is, yes.
But I think it's dropped again fairly quickly.
It's dropped slightly. I mean, I've been keeping an eye on this because I hold some Bitcoin, and I had a certain value in mind that I was interested in, and if it reached that value, I would have sold mine. And it reached that value just before I went to bed, and then it dropped again. But it looks like it does this. I think the average thing is up, but yeah. So it's been going crazy, but not just Bitcoin. Ethereum too, Ripple a little bit. Neo, IOTA,
Litecoin,
all of them have been going crazy. But this article is interesting because you're actually talking about lost Bitcoins.
And I'll preface this. This article was in Fortune.com, and it's about a study that was released saying that nearly 4 million Bitcoins have been lost forever. But I'd encourage listeners, and I'll find the link and put it in our show notes. Take a look in Wired. There was an article by one of I can't remember if it was an editor or a journalist, a staffer there, and basically he had some of those early coins that, the mythical coins that we hear about that suddenly,
Genesis coins.
A few years later.
The Genesis coins? Genesis, I think they're called. Oh, that's the blocks. Anyway, don't worry. I know. Carry on, sorry.
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But the story was, in short, that he put his address, the digital wallet address, or the where I can't quite remember where he was storing the coins. That bit was a bit confusing. I have to read it again. But basically, he had his PIN number or his password, whatever you want to call it, his address on a piece of paper, and the piece of paper got thrown out accidentally by a cleaner. And so it's this terrible story of him going in all these kind of forums and, asking all these experts and saying, what do I do? Is there any way I can get the password back? And he keeps thinking he knows what the password is. So it's like reading one of those stories where someone's got to do some awful trial or tribulation, and you're writing the story with them the whole time.
Yeah.
And so, his family's trying to guess the password. He uses hypnosis, all this stuff. And in the end, he finds a hacker. And I won't tell you what happens because I want you to read the article. Yeah. But it's probably one of the most stressful things I've ever read. But basically, the research paper that was put out by this is one of those hard to say ones. I apologise.
Chainalysis. Chainalysis. I'm going to go for.
Chainalysis. I really hate these made up words because they're awful to say. Basically, talks about all these lost bitcoins, and they're implying it's something like up to around 20% of existing bitcoins have been lost.
Wow.
And most of them seem to be. There's a chunk that are out of circulation. There's some Satoshi coins. There's a little bit of transactional. But it just really makes you wonder, these, what they call the hodler coins, which, how many of these that, someone's done just what this writer did, where they've got some, magic gold mine that they can't quite access, that they kind of remember having invested in, but they don't have the contact details anymore and the security details. So I guess it's food for thought for those of us dabbling with the cryptocurrency.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure
do need to be very.
I'm pretty sure I've lost a few satoshis in various places. And the crazy thing.
Yeah, we need to be vigilant on how we secure it.
Well, the crazy thing is, 0.1 of a Bitcoin now is worth 1,000 or so.
Exactly.
So even 0.001 is worth a few dozen dollars. So, it's actually, you're not talking about cents, you're talking about...
no.
Yeah, it reminds me a bit of... in Australia you have these super funds and people have lots of bits and pieces all over the place. And it's like
That's
that.
right.
And, of course, every time you want to consolidate it, you get charged a fee. And it's the same kind of with Bitcoin. If you want to consolidate all your Bitcoin, you get charged Bitcoin to consolidate them as well. So, you should try... Well... This is actually something Cate and I are going to be looking into, and maybe we'll do a future article on this about the best practices for securing your collections. And in fact, keeping everything in one place is not the best idea unless it's exceptionally secure. And I would even say the same thing with banks and stuff like that. If you keep everything in one bank and it fails, then... so similar.
Yeah,
analogies.
I mean, we've seen some pretty good examples over the last year where all kinds of cryptocurrencies have been hacked in some way, or digital wallets, of course.
Yeah.
So the legacy so far hasn't been the most encouraging.
Yeah.
So it suggests that things need to get a lot better in that way if people really want this kind of currency to go mainstream.
Yeah. All right. On the subject of money, we're going to move on to the next subject, and this intrigues me now. Well, the article itself doesn't intrigue me, but the company. So this is an article on TechCrunch, but of course it was sort of news in all sorts of places. SoftBank makes an offer for Uber shares at 30% discount. The article itself is semi-interesting, but the thing that actually interests me is SoftBank themselves. At the moment, we talked a lot about this on the last podcast about the influence of tech companies and the responsibility they need to take in the future. And there's a lot of companies that come under fire when we have these discussions. But to me, SoftBank are one of these companies that they have got so many fingers in so many pies, but because they're just an investment company, they sort of float under the radar a bit. I just pulled up an article on Business Insider here to try and find, here we go, a list of investments. Chronological order. Let's just go through some of the highlights. WeWork, who actually just invested in Meetup, which is a whole other topic we could discuss, which was kind of interesting. They invested in WeWork. They invested in ARM, who are responsible for most of the processors in mobile devices. They've invested in Uber and Uber rivals. They've invested in lots of payment solutions in India. They've invested in NVIDIA, another chip manufacturer. They've invested in health companies. They've invested in industrial. They've invested in Improbable in London, who I actually have friends who work for them. They make a virtual kind of operating system. They've invested in Boston Dynamics, the robot manufacturers.
Yeah, that's right.
They've invested in Israeli security companies. They've invested in artificial intelligence. They've invested in farming. They've invested in autonomous driving. Uber rivals in Southeast Asia. Money lending. They've invested in Deliveroo, food delivery. They've invested in Roomba. They've invested in Slack, which is a rumour. And now Uber. And I'm pretty sure there's some others there I've heard of. This company has fingers everywhere. And I sometimes wonder if we should be more concerned. What do you think, Kate?
I'd be curious to know how big the investments are.
They're larger. I think they're reasonable. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, some of these would be package deals where they have like a consortium type scenario where, they might lead an investment, but there could be 5 other companies involved or VCs or what have you. But yeah, I mean, it's an interesting strategy. There are a lot of people that will choose a technology to invest in, like mobile or silicon or, I don't know, some kind of hardware or just transport, you know, a particular vertical of tech. But these guys are kind of like, no, we're kind of into all of it, and we're going to spread ourselves out and see where the money is maybe, or see where the future tech is perhaps.
And they're Japanese.
I can't help wondering with the, the convergence of the robotics and the driving scenarios.
Food, healthcare.
You know, they're kind of setting themselves up for
world domination.
Nice, yeah. I mean, when you think world domination, a lot of people just think of Amazon, but who, you know, have certainly spread their wings over the last year, and there's been a few sneaky patents out there and things like that. But it sounds like SoftBank is certainly a contender for that kind of role.
And I think we should have more concern. I'm going to start a new campaign here. It's like, have a bit more concern over what SoftBank are doing. And maybe other VCs, but they're the ones that pop up the most.
Yeah.
Okay. And on continuing the subject of money or finance, this is interesting. So I listen to a lot of American podcasts, and one of the topics that pops up time and time again on American podcasts is net neutrality. And it's interesting because it's a subject that means very little to us non-Americans directly, but means a lot to us indirectly, I think. This is where it's hard to know. And the Obama administration, I actually nearly said the Obama regime then. That was better. The Obama administration under the FCC chief of Tom Wheeler, who was actually initially seemed a bit of an enemy of kind of the free internet, and then actually ended up being a good supporter of it, introduced policies that kind of ensured that net neutrality would be enshrined. And now, under the Trump administration, this is possibly going to reverse. So what is net neutrality? It basically means that all traffic is equal. And non-net neutrality means that certain companies can pay to have their traffic prioritized over others. I mean, in a kind of network infrastructure, this can happen through like quality of service setup, but that's a little different. I mean, that's kind of you prioritize.
I actually saw a really nice video that explained it today in, you know, your kind of 2-minute low concentration terms, and so I'll make sure I put the link down because it was quite well done.
And I mean, I don't want to focus too much on this because it really is not a subject that we know too much about. We're in the European Union. Well, we are generally. I'm not right now, of course, but where things are regulated far more, and the chances of this ever happening are very slim. I mean, even when we were trying to choose our internet package, all the companies pretty much have the same package. Like, there's hardly any competition between them, to be honest with you. You're basically choosing over very minor differences. So it's highly unlikely that... Although
you would probably... I guess be feeling some of the pain points where you are, because one of the ideas is just slow internet access.
Yeah, just let me finish my sentence. I think the European Union were discussing this at some point, but Australia is a sort of different conversation. Their internet problems are around other things, but I guess the important fact is, how will this actually affect people in the rest of the world? I mean, a lot of the companies and services that we use are American-based. And will net neutrality end up affecting everybody because of this? This is kind of the important thing to keep an eye on. If Netflix is slow, which is unlikely actually because they're probably one of the companies that will pay, but coming out of America, will it also be slow for people elsewhere? It's hard to really know, and it will depend very much on the company and how you access it and things like that. But, you know, this is the interesting thing with technology in America, of course, that decisions there will affect us in the rest of the world. So it's important to keep an eye on it. But we don't... Basically, what I was getting at is, outside of America, I think very few countries have the kind of crazy monopolization they have of services. And that's the really big issue, I think, there. But, yeah, keep an eye on it. I mean, it's not... set in stone yet, and it sort of feeds into this American ideal of competition is good, which is sometimes true and sometimes not true. And this is kind of the thing. It's like, well, if companies can increase their innovation by paying more, great. And it's great for the companies that can afford it. But for example, people like us, or even like the Twit network, example, a big-ish podcasting network in the US that a lot of people around the world listen to, but they don't have the kind of money that like Netflix has to prioritize their traffic. It's those kind of people who will suffer the most, kind of middling-sized providers, I suppose. Yeah. I don't know if you've ever heard much about this subject. I hear it a lot on the podcasts I listen to. It's funny that it's come back again. But
yeah, I think it was a repeal of those safeguards that is being proposed, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a proposal at the moment. Yeah, we'll see what happens. But it's important to keep an eye on it, even if you're not in the US. Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. I'll have a read of this article on Wired because I think it sums up quite nicely the current situation, why you should be worried about it, etc. And the interesting thing as well is it not getting too political, but it feeds quite nicely into what is also happening under the Trump administration with the new tax laws that just got proposed, in that even a lot of Republicans are not very on side with some of these things. It's like, they're actually proposing legislation that even the fellow Republicans are not particularly pleased with. So it's kind of it's kind of interesting. All right, we'll have a look at that and keep an eye on it because it'll be important for all of us. When America sneezes, the internet gets a cold.
Okay, now I'm going to introduce our next topics. We're going to be looking a little bit in the past and a little bit in the future, looking at love and intimacy. And the first one I wanted to raise was actually about Second Life. And this article was called The Digital Ruins of a Forgotten Future in a publication called The Atlantic. And it's worth saying, firstly, for those who can't really remember what Second Life is or were never really involved in it, it's a bit like being in VR or being in your own kind of computer game or your own Sim City, your own virtual world where, there's, of course, a screen. There's not like you're wearing Google Glass or anything like that, but it's just a screen on your laptop that you can create characters that are, I guess, in a sense, a representation of yourself, like an avatar, and then they are living what they call literally a second life, to the extent that a Second Life is a marketplace. People can build houses, people can create businesses, people can buy and sell to other people that live in Second Life. And I think one of the most interesting use cases I find for Second Life that I've read in I've heard from different people and read in different scenarios is the idea that people have these whole contained lives that are completely unlike anything else they have in the rest of their if we say their real life, if we can call it that. And it's often people that their real life is like in this article. It talks about parents of people with children with very severe disabilities, people that don't have access to children. There's actually a whole kind of situational scenario in Second Life where people have children, and so other people, adults, pretend to be their children in the Second Life. Some people get married, both in the real life and the Second Life. Some people are married outside of the Second Life, but then they have a second spouse, if that makes sense. It's this fascinating kind of mentality. And what is interesting about the article is the woman who wrote it is kind of trying to get into Second Life, and she finds it clunky, she finds it embarrassing, she finds it kind of, dated and just questions the power of it. But when you think that it's got all these economies just within it, real estate, people hold concerts there, people buy wedding gowns, all kinds of weird stuff. It's really quite fascinating. And when you consider that it's a pretty harmless way for people who may not have escapism in other parts of their life to get some reprise or some safety or some security. It's pretty humbling to think about that.
Yeah, I found it quite fascinating. And actually the thing I found interesting is because it was one of those early kind of Internet 2.0 services that was so hyped and then just vanished. And the article kind of proposes that this was due to Facebook. And I found this interesting. It was like, people wanted an escape into a world that they could create for themselves, but Second Life was almost too much. And the much more simplicity and just text-basedness of Facebook was actually kind of more appealing than this kind of fully immersive world. And this is interesting because towards the end of the article, they start talking about jumps into VR, which make a lot of sense. And of course, Facebook owns Oculus Rift. And, could Facebook itself become the new Second Life? And I guess the question there is, bearing in mind that Second Life was never as big as it was thought it would be, do people even want that kind of environment? Do we prefer just reading streams of text and images instead of a totally immersive thing? Is the whole immersive VR environment overhyped? Maybe people don't want it. I also find these sorts of articles interesting because you have this tendency, one has this tendency to think that just because you haven't heard of a company for a few years, it's gone. And, they still have 600,000 regular users, which is not Facebook levels, but it's decent. There's plenty of companies that would not be upset about that amount of users.
Absolutely.
I found it quite fascinating. And I highly recommend you have a read. And then sort of moving forward, Kate, I think the article that pairs with this is an article from Wired that looks at the...
This article's about Android robotics and a guy called Hiroshi Isaguro who builds Android robotics. And what it looks at is this idea that are we using the robots to represent ourselves, or are we using them to... are we learning from them? Which way is the communication going? And it's it starts with looking at a father with a small child where they're trying to teach the girl to play with the robot, and she ends up just bursting into tears, finding it quite strange. So it's
well, to be fair, he did make a copy of her. Which shouldn't help.
It's a bit weird, right?
Playing with a copy of yourself.
It's like having a doll of yourself. That's kind of weird. Yeah. But this guy, in the last 15 years, he's reduced 30 androids. Most of them are female.
And they're all fairly basic. They're fairly basic.
I've seen some of these, They include replicas of a newscaster, an actress, a fashion model. They've been seen in cafes, department stores, singing in malls, performing in plays. I remember writing about one that was used in an amusement park to welcome people. So a lot of them have fairly benign functions that are fairly limited, let's be honest.
They're not particularly advanced. And I think I'm pretty sure, I read this article a couple of weeks ago now, but I'm pretty sure that it felt like more recently he'd started making less idealised androids.
I think so. I think he'd maybe tried to humanise them a little bit more because, I still think with a lot of this stuff, and, I've got all kinds of opinions on companion robots across the spectrum. I think that there is a propensity to perpetuate this idea of the ideal woman or the flawless woman or the woman without bad traits. Someone who doesn't get sarcastic, doesn't get rude, doesn't get angry, what have you. And is always willing to have, a happy conversation. And I know it's something that's even transferred across to the sex robots because they seem to be something that's growing in popularity. And
I think they have
to the extent that there's a number of them now where they're programmed that the user has to... Sometimes they have to flirt with them first before they can approach any sexual behaviours. Or they have to behave in certain... they have to say certain things or behave in a certain way. Don't ask me exactly what they have to do because I can't... I'm not sure. I don't think this article went that far. Yeah. But, I think that people are rightfully questioning the... the authenticity. I mean, the idea that, we're not only building a companion, but... regardless of how the doll or the person that it represents looks is, not my biggest issue at all. It's more to do with what about the personality beneath it. I think that's kind of interesting.
And I think, I don't know, it's interesting because we talk about this aspect of social networks polishing our kind of lives too much, and when it comes to having relationships with robots, and if they're all idealized, I'm wondering, like, is that the ultimate conclusion of that, and that's just the way it's going to be, or for relationships to really work with robots, they have to be a little imperfect. How much do we actually like that imperfection, I suppose, is the question. Will the pioneers of this start with these very perfected relationships, but for people to actually accept it more fully, they're like, well, this is too creepy. I want a partner robot that argues with me and doesn't do the dishes.
Like, I think what you're saying, the imperfections are what makes it human, right?
Yeah, exactly. But do we like that or not, I suppose, is the question. I mean, so I'm going to tell you something, Kate. It's super funny, and I'm going somewhere with this. When I went on this trip to Geelong the other day, I was talking to a guy there about the podcast, and he listened to it, and he said, I said, oh yeah, I do. I don't know if anyone else has ever picked up on this. Maybe we should be explicit about this right now, a couple of episodes in. So Kate and I are married, and I said, we do the podcast together. And I've kind of got, like sometimes there's that comment about, absence makes the heart grow fonder, and sometimes you want a bit of space and things like that. So I guess the first week I was away, I was like, enjoying a bit of space, and now I'm kind of a bit over it and getting a bit fed up and looking forward to coming home. And he actually said to me, I didn't realise you were married. I thought I should probably tell your wife there was a bit of chemistry between the two of you.
Oh, that's kind of lovely, isn't it?
But basically,
we must be very professional then.
Basically, what I'm getting at is, relationships are not perfect, and you want a bit of space from each other sometimes. You have some good moments, you have some bad moments, but those kind of almost working through those is the point of the relationship itself. And to be blunt, like Kate and I will be married 10 years next year. And there's not so much of the kind of wild, crazy times. A lot of the time it's just having someone around. And actually, it almost feels like...
Are you saying I could be replaced by a doll?
No, not at all, actually. I'm saying that it would be hard to replicate that. Like sometimes you don't actually... It's not actually so much you need to do. Like, I feel like a robot would kind of be like, so you just want me to do nothing? Like, I don't know. It's just like, I don't know. I think it's very hard to replicate because there's, for whatever...
it would be interesting.
Yeah.
It would be interesting to find out people that do have companion robots. And I'm talking about ones that are there for I'm not necessarily in a sexual way, but as company, as opposed to having a domestic task like a robot that helps you get out of bed or something. If they were people that had relationships with humans, like with their contemporaries or not, because I know this is something that has been raised by ethicists. This idea that we'll be raising a generation of people that have only had relationships with robots.
Yeah, and I suppose actually, if you look back through some of the science fiction, which is often where we get inspired for these things, even something like Her, it actually starts to become a little imperfect as well. I don't know. And then this is the interesting thing, because relationships between humans are multifaceted. There's a little bit of sex, there's a little bit of just chemicals that sometimes you can't completely even understand why you are with someone and attracted to someone, just because there's stuff triggered that just draws you to each other. There's companionship, there's mutual self-reliability. A lot of long-term relationships especially are just that, to be blunt, that you need each other. And it's easier.
Very true.
And so there's a lot of aspects to it which I think are sometimes hard to replicate because we don't even understand them ourselves. But now,
I was just going to say, because you mentioned Her and the idea of these connected voice devices. I actually saw a really good short horror film to do with Amazon Alexa, and it's a 2 or 3 minute film, but it's actually quite scary. So I'm going to put the link in the show notes, and I would encourage people, maybe don't watch it in a public space like I did, because I was at a co-working space. I had my headphones on and I just went, "Whoa!" really loud, and everyone looked.
Please do,
But,
please do, please do.
It's definitely worth a look.
Okay, now we're going to take things down a few notches from intimacy with robots to something completely the other end of the spectrum. We're going to talk a little bit about kind of new releases. We'll keep this fairly short because we're running short on time today. In my other podcast, I do the Write the Docs podcast. We did on Sunday, Monday, depending where we are in the world, which is out now. We spoke to the product manager of the Mozilla Developer Network. And if you've ever done any web development, you've probably used the tool at some point, about how they actually merged their documentation with Microsoft, Samsung, W3C, and a couple of other players. And this is actually usually fairly unusual in technical projects to actually get people together to collaborate on something instead of doing their own thing. And I love Mozilla. Mozilla as a company, I always love, because they kind of stand for this open internet, and they've had a few hiccups along the way, but their heart is mostly in the right place. And it made me want to go and download Firefox again. And Firefox just released a couple of weeks ago the new Quantum version. It's faster, it has a new rendering engine, etc., 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 etc. And I downloaded it because I have been struggling with browsers recently. I got a bit sick of Chrome because it's such a memory hog.
You have, haven't you?
I then tried Opera, which I quite liked, but it has some bugs, and it also was... I mean, to be honest with you, most of the problems with browsers are not the browsers themselves, it's that web pages are so heavy with junk. And actually using an ad blocker in Opera really showed me how much junk there was on some web pages. And some of the websites we've mentioned today are some of the worst offenders, actually. But then I got to try Firefox again, and yeah, it's fast, it's nice, but I just have this constant problem with Firefox that it doesn't look very good. And that is important to me, unfortunately. Like, some of the font rendering is weird. It doesn't look very macOS-like. The preference panes are just non-standard, and I don't know. I really wanted to love it, but I ended up closing it again after a day. And yeah, I don't know if you really have any comment on this, Kate. And I just wanted to include it because I almost wanted to get thoughts from people. Like this, it's often this problem with pure open source projects, actually, that the intentions are great, but sometimes the usability is not so good. And I know this from my own experience. It's because often the way that open source projects are funded and developed. And yeah, I don't know. This is a bit of a kind of square peg into a round hole we talked a little bit about this last time as well with developers' focus. And actually this, somewhat at the other end of the scale, this intrigued me in some respects in that it's not even any different in the proprietary world. So macOS High Sierra had a huge bug revealed yesterday, which Apple have now released an update to. And it was a doozy, to quote Kate. You could basically log into the root account, and for anyone who doesn't really understand what that means, basically macOS is a Unix-based system, and every Unix-based system, including Linux, has a root account that is sometimes enabled, sometimes disabled, that gives you, like, supreme control, basically. You're the super user. But it let you log into this account with no password, which is real doozy.
It's really bad.
And the thing that, in my mind, is... this has been spoken about ad infinitum on Mac and iOS or Apple podcasts and news outlets. But High Sierra and apparently iOS 11, I wouldn't really know because I'm not really an iOS user, have been terrible updates. Speaking as a long-term macOS user, High Sierra has literally been the worst macOS I've ever used. There are so many bugs with it, from big ones like this to really random small ones that I've been grappling with and trying to find solutions to and haven't. So the proprietary world is no better, and I sort of almost... I think it feeds very nicely back into what we were talking about last week. Like, just... it's almost like agile development has gone too far. Like, that developers are now like, oh, well, it doesn't matter if there's problems. We can just fix it later. We're agile. It doesn't matter. And I don't know, and it just sparked in my mind, just like, seriously, like, these, I can understand tiny bugs, but these are serious bugs. This is a major problem. Like, I don't know. I don't even really know where to start with this. And it's so fresh in my mind. I haven't really digested it into something cohesive, but I just wanted to mention it. Like, and I don't really want to necessarily relate the two together with saying, oh, Firefox is a bit ugly. Oh my God, what's that about? It's more that saying the proprietary world is no better. It still has these problems too. Sure. And is it just a general representation of sort of what we were talking about last time, that developers are just kind of getting too much sway and all these issues are slipping through because no one's keeping them in check? I don't know. I'm not sure. Any thoughts, Kate? I don't know if this is really a topic that...
I don't know. I'm probably not the best person to talk about it.
Okay, all right.
I'm not a developer, so I don't have to grapple with these issues all day.
Yeah,
like some people.
Well, you have to grapple with the repercussions of them, though. To be fair, you know, you may not grapple with the process, but you grapple with the end result. So
yeah,
you know, and you probably grapple with it.
I should just warn the listeners. I have a grumpy cat who's sitting on the desk at the moment. So if you hear me sound out, she's walked on the keyboard.
Yeah, I don't know. I think this is something I would like to go to in more detail. I actually was just speaking to people on the D-Zone Slack about maybe writing an article about this. I think there's so many facets of it, I don't even know where to start.
You should totally do that.
Yeah.
I think you've got a lot to say.
Yeah. All right, Kate, we're running short on time because I actually have an interview with Circle CI, which...
Very nice.
Interesting company, coming up in about 5 minutes. So we probably
Let's close it off.
Don't have time to go into what have we been writing, etc., etc. The past.
We can do that next time.
Well, maybe we'll link to it in the show notes. Anything very, very crucial coming up over the next couple of days that you want to tell people you're up to or anything, Kate?
I'm going to a startup boot camp tomorrow to see the the demo day. That'll be interesting. So I'll tell you a bit about that in the next show.
And for me, after I leave Australia, and this podcast might come out in time, I'm not 100% sure, I'm going to Dubai, city of the future, for a couple of days. I've got a few interviews lined up. If anyone hears this podcast before that and feels like having a chat with me, then, or post, of course, I could still do interviews after I've left. It's fine. Then please get in touch because there's some bizarre things going on there. And I would be interested in digging into a bit more detail.
In Dubai, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be very interesting.
Just the levels of technology they do, but then offsetting that with some of the kind of other side of things, shall we say, in Dubai. I will report back.
Very true.
So, yeah.
I look forward to it.
Kate, how can the good listeners stay in touch with you and what you're up to?
Yeah, sure. You can have a look on my my website, which is katelawrence.com. Or on Twitter, I'm always tweeting enthusiastically at Kate_Lawrence. That's Kate with a C and Lawrence with a W.
And you can stay in touch with me at chrischinchilla.com and at chrischinch on Twitters. If you enjoy the podcast, please go to gregariousmammal.com/podcast, where you can find show notes and previous shows, and give us multiple stars and thumbs up in this in any of your podcast catching software. And if you especially like the show, you can support us with donations. Bitcoin donations greatly accepted, and merchandise at gregariousmammal.com/support. But for now, that's been us, and we'll talk to you next time.